Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Cloud Data Protection Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rubrik, the Zero Trust Data Management Company, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you. Throughout the summit, we'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsor has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. At the end of this summit, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our editors actually read every comment. I'm one of them, so I know it's true. Your opinions help to future events. And last but not least, at the end of the 3rd session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Nespresso Virtual Plus Deluxe Coffee and Espresso Machine bundle, which includes an Ariochino milk frother and a set of Nespresso capsules. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, Cloud Data Security Basics. For this session, we called on Microsoft MVP Greg Schultz, founder and senior advisor at Server Storage IO and independent IT advisory, consultancy, and creative services firm. Greg has a diverse background anchored by a real-world perspective across applications, data infrastructure, hardware, software, and clouds. In addition to being a Microsoft MVP in Cloud Data Center Management and a 10-time VMware V expert, he's also the author of several books, including Software-Defined Data Infrastructure Essentials, and he's a certified drone pilot. He's an old friend, and we know you're in for an awesome session. Take it away, Greg.
Great. Thanks, John. Hello, and welcome everybody to today's Cloud Data Protection Summit, and particularly for our discussion around cloud data security basics. And we're going to be going through quite a bit of material here, but we'll start out with the big picture, and then we're going to expand. We'll go deeper into some different topics, but it's really to set that stage around cloud data security basics. And when we think about it in the context of this summit today, cloud data protection, let's take that for a moment. Data protection, what does that mean? Simply protect, preserve, serve, and secure and serve information, which means traditional security approaches, but it also means making sure that you've got your data itself protected, copied. So it's really that combination of bringing security disciplines, security topics, and themes along with backup, restoration, business continuance, disaster recovery, and a lot of other related topics. But we're really going to focus around those cloud data security basics. And as we look at this chart here, here's the thing. All the headlines seem to gravitate towards ransomware, and we can't diminish that. We cannot downplay that. But what we need to do is also amplify that there are a lot of other issues, a lot of other threats to your organization. And those threats, those risks, attack vectors, if you like that, or threat risk surfaces, whatever terminology you prefer, there are various, and they impact at different layers and in different ways. They can be internal, they can be external. And as we look across this, we've got the cloud in the background with different things. And we'll drill into these a little bit because that is part of understanding the data security basics is what are the threats? What are we protecting against? What do we need to remediate, fix, repair, recover from? But we have to keep a perspective is that your environment, your cloud could be from the edge, it could be on-prem, core, it could be hybrid, public cloud, multi-cloud. In other words, think of that as spanning horizontally, but also vertically, different layers, different areas of focus, different altitudes, different levels that which things can happen. So as we dig into this, so as we look a little bit more, the different focus areas, again, those different layers of where things can be attacked, where things can be impacted. Down at the bottom, the infrastructure as a service, if you prefer, in cloud vernacular. The basic building blocks, the hardware, the software, the compute, whether it's bare metal, virtual machines, containers and services, whether it's storage, whether it's networking, all those different aspects to it. Or go up a layer, platform as a service, or PaaS, or things like repositories, databases, programming environments, runtimes, different things like that. And go up another layer, software as a service, or SaaS, or app-centric. That could be something as an Office 365, a Salesforce, Box, a G Drive, Teams, a lot of different aspects. And your organization might be using different combinations of these, crafted or defined, put together in various ways. So hence when we talk about cloud data security basics, we have to keep this in perspective that we've got horizontally across different locations, venues, or even platforms or environments, but we also have these different layers, these different altitudes, these areas of focus that we need to protect, preserve, secure, and be able to keep functioning. All right, with that in mind, let's go in a little bit deeper in here. In other words, what can happen? It's not if, it's a matter of what can happen and when. Then the questions start to become, what is that impact? And is it going to be something that you're completely impacted by or partially? But the threat landscape, and we'll drill even deeper into some of these in a little bit, but there's accidental, there's the intentional, the acts of man, acts of nature. That could be loss of data or loss of access to the data. It could be that the apps or the data are damaged. It could be that they've been compromised, they've been stolen, they've been exposed, that they've been made available to somewhere else. But then we also have, so that's coming down from that upper left corner. That's a threat impact. That's why I've got it in red. We've got these issues and challenges coming down from the top right. In other words, compliance, regulatory mandates, mobility, privacy, budget, financial, business requirements, technology decisions, different things like that. And if you like buzzwords, we can work in things like HIPAA and PCI and SARBOX and play buzzword bingo, but we'll touch more on those as we dig deeper into this. Down across the bottom, I've got two pieces here that are part of the solution. And I think it's important to see what are the risks, what are the challenges, but what can you do about it? Then we can dig in a little bit more and understand those different capabilities and how you put them together. So in that lower left are the basic building block enablers, things like encryption of data in transit, encryption of data at rest, encryption of storage, encryption of networks, encryption of virtual machines, and secure boot, things like that. Key management, identity and access management, prevention, detection, remediation. So it's one thing to prevent. It's another thing to detect. It's another thing to be able to remediate it, find out where the hole was, where the leak was, what was compromised, how it happened, and fix it. Does that mean it could mean patching? It could also mean education. Tied into this is archiving, backup restore, business resilience, business continuity, disaster recovery, availability. And then wrapping all that together, the building blocks are policies, procedures, and education. So over on the lower right, that's kind of the putting things together. In other words, how to adhere to different governmental or industry or even self-regulatory policies. Understanding your workloads, the data, the apps, and their dependency, as well as their relative threat risk impacts. Having that timely insight, awareness of what you have, what's happening, and are you under attack? Are they known attacks? How are you leveraging managed detection and resolution capabilities along with automation? So let's dig a little deeper and put some things together here. As we put some things together here, This is just a different way of what we just saw. In other words, there are those bad actors, the attackers. It could be people, but those people have defined software, bots, attackware, malware to attack your environment. So you could be attacked by technology, but one of the most common ways of infiltrating an organization or impacting, attacking, is social engineering. Something as simple as somebody tailgating as somebody's walking through security. Hence the importance of physical security as well as logical. Or somebody spoofing or phishing somebody to get a password or a username or some other piece of information to try to gain access, to gain control into your organization or some aspect to it. And we've got some other pieces here that there is the using the software, the bots, but also combined with that social engineering aspect to it. But we're also seeing more work from home, remote workers, portable devices, portable media, Internet of Things, IoT type devices with different connectivities. And what doors do you have open? I mean, logical, physical, windows, ports, portals. What's open, what's closed? You have public open endpoints, or are they private, are they secured? How are you authenticating? So again, in doing this and having that protection at different layers, at different elevations, think of it as different rings and layers of protection. Okay, so here's another way of looking at it as we continue on our journey here. We see a couple different things. It's having a plan, having the processes, the best practices, the protection and that recovery, being prepared, that readiness, educating the workforce about different threat risks, different impacts. And I always like the adage of, trust yet verify. And I like the fact that the sponsor for today, Rubrik, they take that zero trust approach. Well, the point being there is that that's part of that education, is having your workforce, having all the technology in place, all the automation, all the cool things, but where is your weak point? It could be that all those are in place, but if somebody gets tricked via social engineering, you could be compromised. So hence, there's that importance of having your policies, your procedures, but also educating so that workers, if something doesn't seem right, if something doesn't feel right, that they get in touch with somebody and say, hey, is this valid or not? Is this a real request or not? So that's part of this overall collection of things here that are part of Cloud Data Security Basics and protect, preserve, and secure your environment. All right, so we got three main areas here. The prevention, the protection, the detection and alerts, automation analysis there on the left. We got in that middle there, the education, training, awareness, that preparedness, having those policies and procedures, how you're going to define and put all the technology together. Over there on that right, it's that recovery, readiness, that resumption, be able to remediate, fix and repair after something has occurred. And in the middle there, there's that box with the loops. This is a continuous process. It's a continuous improvement, continuous learning the lessons from something happened, that remediation. How can you improve? How can you improve and secure the environment without making the environment so complex that workers can't get their work done, that then they find ways around it, which could be potentially compromising it? So it's that balancing act of protecting the environment, yet being able to make that environment productive for the users, the people that are working with it, relying upon those resources being available. All right, so what does that mean? It means don't be scared, be prepared. Some of you might recognize that term. It might be familiar, but what it really is, know the threats, detect, defend, deflect, diagnose on those, what those threats are. Are they known? Are they new? Are they minor? And how they impact your organization. What is the impact? Is it something that could result in complete loss, loss of access, or loss of app, or loss of the data? Or is it a partial loss, or a partial destruction, partial damage, partial corruption, denial of service attack? Is it that the data or the apps are compromised, that information is stolen? Is it that the information is stolen, it's locked, and then you're being held ransom for it? Or is it the case that you've got a copy of everything is protected, and you've been able to isolate what was impacted, maybe even how it got in? Now do you have to pay the ransom? So it's in knowing the threats, the applicable impact to the business, the apps and the data. And keep in mind, everything is not the same within an organization. You may have different apps, different data, different workloads that have different requirements, that have different sensitivity, that have different things that need to be protected in various ways. So are you treating everything the same? You have that ability to detect, diagnose, defend, but also to be able to recover, to be able to take things back. You can't go forward if you can't go back in time. And what that means is that if you don't have your protection, your backup, you need to be able to go back once you've got things protected, once you've found the leak, once you found the intrusion point, once you've got everything back to a safe level, you need to be able to get your business back with the apps and the data. And that also comes in leveraging automation, but automation is only as good as the data it is getting in real time, how accurate that data is, and how you've defined that automation to work for you. So there's that combination of different things, and having that plan and be able to remediate, keep your system up to date, whether that be with patches, updates, and applying new techniques. Okay, so let's go a little deeper here. What are the threats? Well, and more importantly to the threats, what's the applicable impact to the business or a division of the business and particular apps? Is the threat, that should be threat, not treat, sorry about that. Is the threat or the incident real, or is it part of a larger phishing attack or probe? In other words, something might be seen as, oh, hey, we're under attack right now, but it might be maligned. It may not really be the big threat, that somebody might be just testing what's open, what ports are open, what endpoints can be compromised, how can we get in? So is it a real threat or not? Is it part of something larger or not? What's the impact scope? Is it impacting everything, or just a particular geography or a specific area or a specific application capability? Is the data and or the apps, are they intact? Is it simply that access is being denied, or that the data has been compromised, the apps have been compromised, and they're being locked out? What is that scope? What is that layer? Is it low layer, in that infrastructure, or in that platform layer, or higher up in the apps? What is that impact? That's where having that timely insight, awareness into your environment, knowing what's going on, what's happening at a given point in time, that's key. And with the clouds, if you don't have that visibility, if you don't have that insight, even with all the automation, avionics, dashboards, it's only as good as the information, the telemetry it's receiving. Otherwise, you're flying blind. So that becomes really important, is understanding what is happening, what has happened, and being able to go back and determine how it happened as part of the remediation. Okay, so as we keep on this journey here, let's bring up another aspect to this. So as a part of this, I mentioned don't be scared, knowing the threat risks, is earlier we talked about those different layers, horizontally across from the edge to the on-prem to the core cloud, public, private, but also those different layers, higher level application, lower level infrastructures. And when we talk about the different threat risks, it could be a denial of service, it could be a virus, it could be malware, something causing destruction, or a ransomware locking it up, or theft. And it could be accidental, intentional, could be full or partial. It could be a human error. It could be a technology failure or fault. And it could be external or internal. And it could be across different portions of the business. But then there in the middle, we see, what is that impact? Is it a full destruction, or is it partial? Is it that there's some data lost or corruption, or everything's impacted? is that the data's okay, you just can't get to it, or you can get to it, but the data's not, or that it's leaked. So again, this is what we want to keep in perspective against some of these different threats, some of these different things that can and do happen, not just on-prem, but in the cloud, not just in the cloud, but also on-prem. Okay. Now, let's also look a little bit deeper now at, we've got these different things that can happen. It could be acts of nature, fire, floods, hurricanes. It could be a bot attack. It could be denial of service, ransomware. But where is that impacting? Is this just another way of visualizing what I showed you a little bit ago about those different layers? Is it that the virtual machines have been compromised, or an operating system, or a file system, or runtime, or that containers, or a database, or applications, the network? Where is the impact? Is it across everything across the board, or is it compartmentalized? Can it be isolated, or has it been isolated? Again, this is where having that insight, that awareness into what's going on, having that visibility is so important. All right, so what this comes back to, if you recall a little bit ago, we showed you that picture of the those three triangles, okay? There's the protection, in other words, being able to deflect attacks, whether that be firewalls, whether that be access controls, network security, app security, physical, logical, but deterring, preventing things from happening, and at different threat risks. Okay, you may be under attack by a lot of low-level impact attacks, but that could be handled via the automation to deflect and deter, prevent. But what if you get hit by something new that the automation doesn't know about yet? So this also ties into leveraging your staff expertise. Because instead of having your staff, your personnel responding to lots of low-level threats, have the automation deal with that. And leverage your resources, your people, your staff, your consultants, service providers for those exceptions. It's kind of like you apply your automation to the exceptions right away or to the norm. I would say go, if you can do both, great. But leverage the automation for things that are time-consuming, that are relatively known. Leverage your expertise, because that expertise can help define the automation to do that next level of prevention, to learn to do more, whether it's traditional automation or AI-based or so-called AI, whatever that happens to be. But on the left there, we want to deflect, detect, deflect, protect, but if something does get in, we want to be able to detect and defend, respond in that middle there, and leveraging personnel for those exceptions, leveraging the technology, but also knowing that we've got good backup. We've got the backup, the restore, the availability, archives. We're leveraging the security, the firewalls, encryption to defend. But if something does get through, then over there on that right, we have that capability to be able to restore, to go back, detect, and have logs, to be able to look through the logs and figure out what happened and when, and what's that scope, what's that impact. Again, having that visibility into things. All right, so as we build out here, so again, don't be scared, be prepared, and what that means is now let's dig a little deeper. It's that detection, that diagnose, defend, the deter, educate, having backups. So it's knowing the threats and their impact to your organization. Again, everything is not the same. Plan for that unexpected. Plan for complete reconstruction or a granular restoration. In other words, an entire app may not be impacted. It might just be a subset. It may not be the entire organization. It might just be a particular application landscape that's impacted. So having not just a backup, having not just a protection, having that granularity. And that granularity also applies to the access controls. Are you using granular access controls, granular credentials, or are you using broader? what I mean by that is you have that ability to fine-tune who has access to what applications, to what data, even across administrators, whether they're system admins or operations or database or network or security, who has access or who can get access, who's got the different credentials, and how can you remove those credentials when needed. So part of that, it plays into having that defense, having that deterrence, having that detection, and being flexible with that. Leveraging things like air gaps and offline and offsite protection. How are you going to allow authentication between, say, on-prem and the cloud, or edge and a core cloud? How are you authenticating that? How are your endpoints secured? What are your credentials? What are your policies? All right, so as we look at that, here is, we start to get into, for those that like the technology and the buzzwords and the acronyms, we're there. We're there now. So as we look at this, protecting, preserve, and securing, cloud data security basics. And there's a lot going on here because there's a lot of different aspects to this. As I mentioned earlier, cloud data security is a combination of security topics, logical and physical, business continuance, backup restore, database admin, sysadmin, compute, storage, network. There's a lot of different aspects. There's a lot of different players. There's a lot of different skill sets. So it's a holistic. And one of the aspects to that is, even if you have a siloed organization with siloed teams, you need to at least have a virtual team or a tiger team, if you like, that are cross-functional. They cut across the different groups, that they're able to work collectively together to protect the organization. Yeah, you got to protect the network. You got to protect the virtual machines, the compute, the containers, the services, the storage. You got to protect the databases, all those different things. But holistically, everything's got to be working together. The end goal is to protect the organization, its data, its apps, its information. So you got a lot of different things going on there. The network access, the endpoints, the public and private, IoT and mobile devices. How are you supporting work from home? The keys, credentials, the settings. And by the way, are your backup, the people tasked with doing backup restore, are they making sure that all the credentials, the security settings, the keys, the access, that they're all being protected and that they're being encrypted so that you can restore those when needed? And doing all that without impacting productivity. Are the different apps being protected, their access, their use, as well as the database, repositories, things like that? And what about the management tools? Or you have logging turned on, so if something gets deleted, it's logged, and not just that something got deleted, that it got deleted and by whom, so that you can go back there and detect that. Are you doing hard deletes or soft deletes? Do you have it where anything that's deleted goes into a holding area, a trash bin, if you prefer, and that it's held there for a period of time as part of a policy that if something does get accidentally deleted, it can be undeleted? Or is it a hard delete? It's deleted, it's gone. So all that comes back together, and then again, combining with physical and logical. And we see a lot of different areas. We could put more rings around different things, but yeah, there are focus areas, for example, around the compute, having secured VMs, having protected memory, things like confidential compute, different things like that, secure boot, whether it's for bare metal, virtual machine, or containers, having the databases, having your different RSA files and your credentials being able to access, while also supporting different initiatives like GDPR, HIPAA, and things like that. So let's build out on this a little bit more. We've talked about the attacks, we've talked about different threats, different challenges, and that's what we also have to keep in mind is those buzzword compliances, the GDPR, global data protection, HIPAA for healthcare, PCI, payment card industry, Starbucks. But also, what about mergers and acquisitions? How are they being integrated in? Do you still have VPN-based networks, or do you have some other authentication type capability? Are you running multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication? When something happens, are you going to know about the intrusion, or are they unknown? Do you have that ability to go out and scan and assess and detect that, hey, something has happened, we need to look a little bit deeper? And with your logs that I mentioned a bit ago, are you protecting those logs? Are you securing them so that you can go back and be able to work with those and across the different areas? And the different tools, the technologies, without going into who does what, who makes what, how do they work. It's just having those tools. MDR tools, manage, detect, resolve, identity access, IAM, multi-factor authentication, protecting your keys, your certificates, your passwords, having shared access signatures, for example, if you're doing things in the Azure world for remote storage, making sure HTTPS is turned on for sites, for URLs, along with dealing with SSL and Kerberos, and again, logs. Turn logging on. Yeah, there's a cost to it, but is the risk of not having those logs outweigh the cost of having them? Okay, could be a penny wise, pound foolish thing. Yeah, we're going to save some money turning logs off. Turn your logs on. If that creates a problem, talk with people. Find out more how you can alleviate the performance bottleneck, the storage cost of having those logs on. Maybe you don't have to have everything turned on, but how will you go about doing that? And encryption, at rest, while data's in movement, and even within the VMs, protecting the VMs themselves, protecting the memories. Okay, a couple more here. Is again, having those rings, those layers of defense, having that timely insight, having that timely awareness into what's going on within your organization. Understanding you have visibility that, hey, somebody just is trying to break in is somewhere, whether it's in your operations center, your network operations center, NOC, or your security operations center. Are teams being alerted that, hey, we've got an intrusion attempt, or it looks like somebody may have gone by. Automation is doing what it can do, but we need that virtual team to get involved and start looking at things from different perspectives and either say, yes, here's where it is, or rule things out so that you can focus in on what's happening. Instead of looking for the needle in the haystack, remove some of the hay from the stack, and all of a sudden you might be able to find where that needle is. So it's leveraging that automation, but also adding to that with the right people. Doing things like penetration testing, pen testing, having red attack teams and blue defense teams and how they're going to resolve and test to make sure where are the known holes. Know about them, find out about them ahead of time so that you can protect them. Something does happen, do those post-incident analysis and forensics, learn from those lessons, but also apply that remediation. And again, update training for your staff, for your users of your system, and have those best practices and make sure they're being implemented. And again, we're coming back to that social engineering awareness and training. Okay, so again, don't be scared, be prepared. And as we've talked about this, it's leveraging automation. However, automation is only as good, as I mentioned, to the data that it has. Automation is not the magic silver bullet, if you would, or it's not the pixie dust. It's to leverage and combine with all the other pieces to your defense, to your cloud data security protection scheme. Again, understanding what's the impact, leveraging that automation to take care of routine type tasks, to be able to figure out, is it time to actually start a restoration effort? Or is it the point of, here, we need to isolate these particular apps, this particular data, this particular part of the network, while everything else looks to be safe, that can continue working. Let's just focus on this area here for right now, and then go from there. what is your recovery point? How far back do you have to go? Well, do you know how far back the attack occurred? Something important with ransomware, hence having those protection schemes at different points, different intervals, but also that granularity. Do you know what was attacked and what are the other relative impacts? And again, using those logs that you've enabled, can you detect that, hey, it looks like they've got in by using this particular user's credential. We should probably isolate those credentials for now. Let's figure out also where else have they gone. Can we anticipate where they might be going, or have we eliminated them? Have we been able to sequester what's been happening and minimize the impact of that attack? Okay, so I've touched on this, and we're not going to dwell on this, but it's having that recovery. If you can't go back in time to a particular point, whether it's a full restoration or whether it's granular, how are you going to go forward? You've done your detection, you've done your defending, you've done everything that you should have done, that you could done, and maybe more. But something does happen, whether it's accidental or intentional. Hence, that having that backup, that restore, and however you go about doing that with disk, with tape, with solid state, certainly leveraging the built-in capabilities of the cloud provider, but adding that extra granularity for your own applications, for your own needs. And again, protecting at different layers, at different locations, and being able to go to different points in time, and having the ability that if you go to a particular point in time, you've got a protection interval, but is that corrupted or is it good? So having that flexibility, and do you need to do a full or a partial? Can you just bring back a couple of key files? Okay, this also gets into having gaps. Real quickly, there's good, bad, and ugly gaps. Good gaps are air gaps where your data and your apps are isolated. They're maybe in the cloud, but they're not online accessible. There's also time gaps, different recovery points, different points from which you can recover from to go back in time to go forward. Bad gaps are gaps in time where you've missed a protection interval, where the backup wasn't running, or the snapshot, or some other mechanism. And the ugly ones, what you thought was recoverable wasn't. In other words, you trusted, but you didn't verify. You trusted, but you didn't have, you weren't sure what things were really protected or not. So that's where you've got to go back and test what was actually protected. Can you actually restore it and actually use it versus just assuming, yeah, it looked like everything happened. All right, let's start to wrap up here. And have that plan, keep it up to date, evolve it, make sure your training is a part of that, education. It's not all about the technology, it's how you use it, how you define it, how you craft it together to meet your environment and your particular application needs. And that's the people, the processes, policies, and it's an organization-wide. The business should drive what it needs to be protected to stay in business. And then the information technology specialists, security, the different admins, the different focus groups implement that. All right, and this comes into, right before we wrap up, assessing those threat risks and impacts. Know and understand your business. Looking beyond the IT and the tech. What does the business need versus want? Needs equals funding. Want equals wish list. If the business says, we need this, they should be able to fund it. If the business says, we want this, well, then they should be able to fund it. What are the threat risks and their relative impact, not just to the business, but to the different departments, to the application functions, and across the organization? Maybe finance is looking for ways to cut the budget, cut costs. Okay, great. What are the impacts, and is the rest of the business, the rest of the organization, aware of what those cuts mean to the business impact? So in other words, get the different departments of the business, the different stakeholders involved. Get their fingerprints on the decision. And if they just say, well, you know what, we trust your judgment, you're the expertise, get their fingerprints on it. Because if something does go wrong, What's usually going to happen? Well, they're going to point fingers and say, well, geez, it wasn't our decision. So in other words, get the different parts of the business involved, get different teams from across the organizations, that it's more than just a security, more than just a network, more than just backup restore, more than just the system admins, the database admins, the different focus all working together. So wrapping up, have a plan, be ready to adjust, execute, monitor, and remediate. And it's a shared responsibility, both for the cloud provider as well as within your own organization and across the teams. Know your biz and app requirements, the threat risks, the workload profiles, and the best solution is the one that works for you. And keep those different stack layers in perspective. All right, where to learn more? My blog, storageioblog.com, my book, storageioblog.com/books. I'm on Twitter, my email is there. And with all of that, let's bring John back in and do some Q&A. John?
Thank you. Thanks, Greg. We're going to get the Q&A now. Remember, everybody, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Let's start with this one here from Vic. If an attacker gets into our network, how do we prevent them from accessing other apps for the cloud and vice versa?
John, that's a great one, and hopefully that organization has already implemented rings of protection, layers of defense, such that once somebody gets in, they're free to just roam the hallways, per se. That, if we use that vernacular analogy of a physical intrusion, that, if they get into the building, are the doors to the different rooms locked? If they get into a room, are the drawers, the file cabinets, the computers locked? If they get into a computer, and they get onto the network, can they access a file system, or can they access a different app? So that's what gets back to, if you have those different layers and rings of protection, and if you've got the detection that, hey, your systems, your tools have detected that somebody is intruding, they shouldn't be in there. Nobody should be in that office after 8 p.m. at night. That probably triggers an alert.
Okay. Let's look at this question from Tori, who's wondering, are hybrid and multi-clouds safer or just more complex to manage?
A little bit of both there, in that when you have multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, whatever it happens to be, the more you have, the more you go horizontally, but also the more you go in those up and down cycles, the more complexity you are going to have, okay? But that's also where hopefully the tools come into play, not just the automation, but your insight, your awareness tools that are able to see and work across that. Now, does the complexity add a security risk? Yeah, if not attended to, but that should be part of your plan, is how are you getting those different resources, those different clouds, to be able to work together in a secure fashion.
Okay, so Ria's wondering, do clouds provide better protection against ransomware?
If I'm a cloud provider, I'm going to say, well, yes, of course they will. But then, we got to be real here. We got to be realistic. Is that it's how you're using those resources, how you're using that cloud. What are you following that cloud provider's best practices? And have you applied your own best practices to make that environment as secure as possible? If you put everything together and using everything correctly, that resulting environment can be very secure. If you haven't, again, it goes back to that shared responsibility.
Okay, here's one from Lynn. Looking for any advice on handling costs. As the volume of data increases, the cost of cloud data protection can increase significantly. Organizations need to balance the cost of data protection with the value of the data and the business needs.
Yeah, there's a lot there in that. There's a lot there to unpack, so to speak. But here's what it comes down to is understanding the business, hence getting that business involved, and it's a balancing act. What's the relative threat risk to the whole organization versus a departmental or a particular function? And what does that cost to offset that? I mean, think in terms of insurance. There is that aspect to it. But part of that is that as you enable more protection, more tools, there's a cost to that. Are you getting a cost? Are you getting a return on that investment by being able to reuse those resources for other things? Or are you able to say, look, we had this number of attacks, we had these number of threats. Had they gotten through, this would have been the relative impact. Of those that got through, here's how we were able to resolve them with the tools. Those that had an impact, here's how quickly we were able to fix them. So it's having that awareness, and not just that something is happening, but what does that cost to the business? What does that benefit to the business? And watch out for being a penny wise, pound foolish.
Okay, here's one. Kenny's wondering, who should be responsible for cloud security and data protection?
Well, being able to shared responsibility model, that means multiple teams. That means you could say it's all the security team. Well, then they're taking it all on. If they're smart, they get the involvement of others. If they're looking at having a fiefdom or whatever you want to call it, it should be a shared. And the business should say, yeah, security may be taking the lead on this, or maybe our business continuance group is going to take the lead, or some other is going to take the lead, but that there should be a multidisciplined, multi-skill set focus to this, because this does touch across many different areas. Where it's worked on as a team, as a collective organization, maybe under the CIO. And maybe the CIO tells the CISO that it's their responsibility to lead up that team, and they in turn get multiple different players. So it's a shared responsibility. It should be a shared effort, but it should also be a compromise by committee.
Gotcha. So here's one from Walter wondering, what is the security consideration for IoT and edge combined with the cloud?
Yeah, great one is that with all the mobile devices that are now being out there, that are supporting, that are accessing apps, certainly they need to be considered. And rather than excluding them, include them as part of that protection. Are they a secured endpoint? How are they accessing and how are they getting onto the different networks? And are your IoT devices, your sensors, your different devices that are out there in the wild, so to speak, could somebody gain access to those and use that as an access path to get back into your network? Could they physically unplug a sensor and tap in and gain access? So that's where there's that protection out at the edge that's needed, but also that detection that, hey, something isn't quite right. Normally this device doesn't behave like this, and leveraging the different tools.
Okay, here's a very sort of very basic question coming from Vic again. Are clouds less secure than on-prem? I guess inherently less secure than on-prem.
Yeah, that's one that goes back and forth, and some will argue that clouds are more risk. Some will say that you have to be on-prem. And it really comes back to how you're using it, what cloud, what capability. Are you using the general purpose public cloud, or are you using one of the more optimized, like government cloud aspects of a public cloud? Are you enabling things like secure boot and confidential compute and a lot of other different things like that, and all the things that go along with it? And have you inadvertently opened up any endpoints or opened up any access by not following best practices or by doing something that shouldn't have been done? So you could get into an interesting discussion is one more secure than the other? Well, if your organization is considered ultra secure, are you applying those same best practices to the cloud? That you actually have better capabilities, better policies than what the cloud provider's best practices are. So that's why it could go either way, but here's the real thing. Ultimately, it can come back to control. Can you say that you have more control over your own cloud on-prem than you have if at a public cloud, if that is the main focal point?
Looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Greg, what an awesome session. Thank you so much.
No worries, John. My pleasure.
So we're going to take a short break now, folks, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Cloud Data Security Top Do's and Don'ts, led by Karen Lopez, Data Evangelist for Info Advisors, and moderated by my colleague, 1105 Media Site Producer Extraordinaire, Chris Paoli. Many thanks to Greg Schultz for a great session and to our sponsor, Rubrik, for making it possible. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsor. And remember, during our next session, we will be giving away a Nespresso Virtual Plus Deluxe Coffee and Espresso Machine bundle, which includes an Ariochino milk frother and a set of Nespresso capsules. But you must be with us to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course our sponsor, Rubrik, for underwriting the summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Cloud Data Protection Summit called Cloud Data Security, Top Do's and Don'ts. Our speaker for this session is Karen Lopez, Data Evangelist for Info Advisors, Space Enthusiast, and NASA Datanaut. Karen is a senior project manager and architect with an extensive background in development processes and information management. She specializes in taking practical approaches to systems development. She has 20-plus years of public speaking, which includes keynotes, speeches, and demonstrations. She wants attendees to have fun, gain insight, and take away inspiration for working with new technologies and methods. She's known for a slightly irreverent and practical approach to IT training and speaking. Take it away, Karen.
Thanks so much, Chris. Also, I always forget that I have my NASA Datanaut thing on there, and it makes me happy. That's a volunteer position, by the way. I don't work for NASA, but I help mentor people wanting to work with NASA and other space agency open data. There's my little commercial for that. The other thing you're going to notice about this slide right here is it does mention some Microsoft certifications, the fact that I'm a Microsoft MVP. And the reason I'm pointing that out is not to brag, but because I tend to use Microsoft-like technologies or refer to Microsoft products when I'm speaking. But this is only to give examples. I am not vendor specific here. I will point out where I know where other cloud providers have another name or whether they have similar features. But I just wanted everyone to know my native technology language tends to be Microsoft-like products. And I hope that's fair. That's just our abstract. So today for this session, first of all, I want to say I'm so flippin' happy that you people are here, that you're taking time out of your day to spend with us to talk about a topic that I think is just so important. It's something I'm passionate about. That is both data, because my Twitter ID is DataChick, and security. Plus, having been in this business, I know my bio says 20 plus years, but it's actually more like 30 plus years, but no one wants to put that on a slide. One of the most exciting things that I've been working with in my career is when new innovation comes and transforms how we work with data, how we use data. And I see the cloud as that. So it's bringing together a whole bunch of things I'm passionate about. So please don't save your questions to the end. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of this, but you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A. And if Chris sees one that's really relevant to the slide I'm talking about, he's going to pop in and ask that. And I might see it as well, but let's just not leave them till the end. I also don't mind seeing comments or something in the story like, hey, this happened to me too, or, oh my gosh, I didn't even know that was a thing. The other thing is the stories I tell or the stories you might hear in any presentation, you should always assume that it's not about any organization I'm currently working for or even any organization you're working for. It's just an organization. And I also love continuing these conversations on social media. I'm on Twitter a bit. I'm on Mastodon. There's going to be a link in my closing slide. But even LinkedIn, I hang out a lot at LinkedIn. And so, we can continue to talk security today. I want to make sure everyone has fun learning these things. I always say in about an hour-long session, if you can learn 3 new things, 3 new terms, 3 new approaches, then you've probably spent that hour. So that's my goal for all of this. And I want you to share the tips, the things you've learned on Twitter and social media, because that's just as important. So let's talk about one of the first things that I always talk about in my security presentation is the difference between what I call data security and application security. This particular presentation is primarily focused on data security. Application security, the things that developers do to harden their applications, to harden servers, to inspect their code for possible SQL injection and those sorts of things. I do have an interest in those, but due to our time limitations, today we're going to speak primarily about data security and not application security. So again, it's data focused, not application. I'm going to focus a lot in my explanations and stories and examples on databases and data stores and storage. But of course, cloud security is much more than that, but we're talking data today. I wanted to list, this is sort of an outline for what I'm going to be talking about today, is the biggest factors, risk factors, cost factors, success factors for securing data in the cloud. And as usual, people are always an important thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about database level security. So things that are inside a database, inside a table, inside an instance, all of those. Then some storage level security, and by that I mean files, logs, videos, media, those sort of things that typically these days live outside a database. I'm going to spend time talking about what I'm calling modern services. So many cloud vendors, or even Microsoft, have this new approach of cloud-first development. And what that means is, these days, if a database vendor or a data storage vendor has product offerings that are both in the cloud, services in the cloud, infrastructure in the cloud, and on-prem things, so the example would be SQL Server on-prem, SQL Server in the cloud, Azure SQL DB, which is kind of like a database as a service, they start introducing new features and advanced features in their cloud versions first, figure out how it works. They can look at success stories and client stories, and then they introduce it into on-prem things. And that's also a major change to how we used to do things, how vendors used to do things, is they would always handle their box service, their on-prem installed on your infrastructure products first, and then try to put it into the cloud. But now that has changed. And so I'm calling the services that are available in the cloud as the modern way, the way vendors are providing things. Then I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about data literacy and why it's important to cloud data security, and then what I'm calling plain old cloud factors. Makes it sound really bad, but it is exciting. So let's talk about people. I could do a whole presentation on why data security is so dependent on people. This is also where most of us tend to have the best stories, the saddest stories, the funniest stories. And I know there's a couple of internet memes and cartoons out there, and even a saying by Professor Staff, who is used to be the director of Psorias at Purdue University, and he has a quote that says something like, "The only secure server is one that has had the power removed, encased in concrete, and buried in a bunker." And so, yeah, the ultimate security. I have a lot of stories here, and one that I want to tell, that you'll see this mentioned throughout, is that on my, I said not my current projects, I've heard stories in other organizations of the fact that security professionals are having the hardest time working with the most experienced people in their teams. And it's usually a little bit different, But there's sort of this human psychology thing going on where people who are used to doing things like me for 30 years are struggling to understand the new security and compliance rules that we have, that we used to be able to do things all the time with data, and it wasn't a problem. So examples might be, we could buy customer lists and plug it into our systems and add them to mailing lists and start selling them our products. But now, throughout most of the world, there's anti-spam and privacy legislation that just doesn't allow that. So if you've got someone either in the business or on the IT side who wants you to break compliance rules or legislation, that's a security problem, because data is going to be collected in a way it's not allowed. It might be breached. If you've illegally collected data and added it to your systems and it gets breached, that's like 2 negatives against you in court. So like anything in IT, if it wasn't for the users, our jobs would be a lot easier. Okay, I don't really believe that, but that's my irreverent side of my presentation. So let's talk about the obvious people do things here for cloud data security. Continual training. And there's an asterisk there, because I'm not just referring to in-classroom formal training, sending people off to learn about what SQL injection is, how to harden your cloud file storage. I mean, all of that does need to happen. But when I'm talking about continual training, I'm meaning little slices of training as well. So a lot of companies now have employee and staff portals where people are asked to go watch short videos. Other organizations do like brown bag lunch training for some of these things to remind people what the biggest threats are, what are the new social engineering tricks that people are doing, that bad actors are doing, trying to get access to their systems. So a lot of people think of security training as something, that you do, it's formal, you do it once a year, or maybe once every time you come into a new organization if it's really bad. We should consider doing data security training on a regular basis. The other form of this is this is really a storytelling cultural thing, is I am always in my projects and other projects I've heard of telling data security stories, like something that happened in the newest breach that was a really unique way of a bad actor doing things. I also tell security stories about insider threats, where either a disgruntled employee, an employee who has had a family member kidnapped and being used to get access to data that they shouldn't have access to, just constantly telling those stories. So instead of saying, oh, don't click on malicious links, because, well, that sounds obvious. And yeah, we should tell people not to do that. But we should also give people stories and real-world examples of what we mean by that. The other thing we need to do, so Jerry Weinberg in his book, Secrets of Consulting, which, by the way, is not about consulting, it's about the art of giving and receiving advice, says you should trust everyone, but always cut the deck. And one of the ways in this analogy to cutting the deck of a deck of cards after they've been shuffled is that we need to constantly monitor and measure what actions are being taken on data. Now, this is a new thing that either was too expensive for us to do, too complex, too hardware costly or something. But the most modern security approaches to protecting data in the cloud is monitoring behaviors, much like websites do, so that they can detect when an individual user is having abnormal either access or authorizations or getting admin access to things that they normally don't do, or downloading thousands of files in an hour instead of their normal 2. And that all gets put into behavioral analytics. And there are a lot of things happening both in the cloud providers and by third-party vendors that are using, AI or modeling in order to determine when a system or a person's actions on data is just way out of line for what they're doing. So a good example would be, end of year processing of financials or inventory. That might show up as abnormal from the other weeks in the year, but it also shows up when there's like mass encryption of data through ransomware. It shows up when someone has decided to download the customer file or download all the contracts because they're planning on leaving and bringing customers with them. These are modern things. These work both on-prem, hybrid, and in the cloud and multi-cloud, but these are things that I think cloud providers are bringing to us in a way that's much more integrated with all the resources we have in the cloud. So some don'ts. This one has kicked me in the bum so many times is I assume a new hire that has great experience, a great track record, lots of good references, is well known to everyone on the team, that they know about our organization's security policies, what kind of data we handle, what's the compliance and legislative requirements about that type of data. The other is I do a lot of onboarding security training at some clients. It's about telling people what our security requirements are, what our data policies are, where to find those things. I have to remind people, hey, we have a policy that doesn't allow what you're talking about doing. So I don't want you to assume that people know about data security, especially things that are specific to your organization, or that they will remember them. So we constantly tell stories and we monitor, what are people wanting to do with the data. So this is where I come back to thinking, I do think experience is a huge benefit, being that I'm so old and experienced. But what I mean is, the longer someone's been working in IT, the more they're used to doing things the way we always used to do things. And the experienced people, including myself, get frustrated because there's just so many guardrails now. Like, you can't just email around a spreadsheet of 1,000 customers with their contact information and their medical records, and it just seems to happen all the time. And it's because that's the way we've always done it. Like, it wasn't a problem 10 years ago to do that. Well, it was. There just wasn't a legal reason not to do it. The last thing is we shouldn't assign labels to people, but to behaviors. So we all make mistakes. And I have emailed a spreadsheet that had sensitive data in it, not because I forgot about the security principle, but I forgot that particular spreadsheet had another tab on it that did have sensitive data. So was I a bad person for doing that? No, I just experienced bad behavior on my part because I didn't understand this data resource. So like we offer on some of my project tips, let's just not email any spreadsheets. Let's save into OneDrive and email a link where people have access. And there's a whole bunch of other productivity and collaboration reasons for doing that, but that gets people out of the habit of attaching spreadsheets that they don't know what it is. And then finally, don't trust people. And it's not because they're bad people, it's because of what Jerry Weinberg said. We're all human, we make mistakes. Always trust people, but always cut the deck. Sorry. So the database level security thing. Now this is where, I have whole presentations on each of these bullet points, so I'll try not to get into deep here. Inside databases and tables, these are in SQL Server and Azure SQL DB. These are fairly new things, in the last 5 years, but they exist. Data masking. Data masking in SQL Server and Azure SQL DB is called dynamic data masking. That's because it doesn't mask data as it's stored in the database files. It masks it upon presentation. And data masking really isn't a security thing. I know Microsoft calls it that, but I think of it as a privacy thing. It means that when people send it to a report, Power BI, to their screen, that you only see the last 4 digits of a credit card number. You don't display all that. I can remember 15 years ago when your credit card number and its expiration date got printed at the bottom of every receipt. We don't do that anymore. We mask it. Oracle, and I just looked up a couple things, both Oracle and MySQL offer dynamic data masking as well, and both of them also offer static data masking. So static data masking is when the data stored in the database is actually masked as well. And those are two ways of implementing the same thing. One of the trade-offs with static data masking is that now when you run your queries, you can't match up things if they're overly masked. The reason I say it's not a security feature and that it's a privacy feature is that if you mask it enough to protect the data, then all of it should be masked. So then data masking doesn't make sense. So typical data masking, like I see it at the airport, it'll be up on the display. Here's the list of people waiting on an upgrade or waiting for a seat on this plane. And it's typically first initial and the first three letters of the last name. Well, sometimes that's enough information to give away who the person is because there are plenty of last names that are 3 characters or less, and there are plenty of people who go only by an initial. So it's not quite security because it can reveal too much information, but it's to give enough information that you can guess that K.LOP could be me, but it also could be someone else. It could be my twin brother, Ken. And then there's blockchain and ledger tables. These are fairly new. So Oracle has blockchain tables. SQL Server has ledger tables. These are a combination of storing of cached digests of changes made, inserts, deletes, and updates into a table. And again, there's a very long presentation I could do on this, but it gives you what some people have had to develop on their own, or it's better than things like change data management or some of these things that keep track, or temporal tables, which keep track of data over time, because the difference with ledger and blockchain tables is that the digest and the hash in the blockchain for this data, it can't be changed. It's immutable. So the digest, so a bad actor that had admin access could go in and try to change the data, but if they did, it wouldn't validate anymore because there'd be tamper evidence. Like I said, Oracle has these, SQL Server has these, they're slightly different implementations. Row-level security is just, I should only see my own patients. I shouldn't see all the patients in the database. Encryption's been around for a long time, but now we're starting to learn that database encryption isn't enough, and end-to-end encryption is good. More robust auditing of changes in ways that an insider or someone with admin stuff, there's a whole bunch of things. And the reason I bring this up is during my career, we had to roll our own ways of doing this in an application. And the problem with that is not all data access to a database or a data store happens in an application. But I find that a lot of companies, because they've rolled their own, just wants to keep using their own homegrown, home-developed masking and row-level security and all those things. And that's that experience getting in the way of using modern things. The other thing I love about these things is if they're in the database, it's protected in the database, no matter what you're using to access these things. So some do's. My mantra is secure your data as close to where the data is as you can, and to use the features in your database engine to implement that feature and not roll your own, develop your own, because chances are how the features are implemented by a large team at a vendor, now having talked to millions of installation, is probably going to be more robust than what you thought of to deliver. My last one is a contentious one. I believe that we should do native backups in addition to storage level backups. This is a contentious thing with DBAs and storage people. But native backups within your database engine typically allow you much more granularity, many more restore options versus snapshots and storage level backups. Some don'ts. No longer rely on only application level security. This is one of the biggest debates I have with developers and DBAs. I believe strongly your data is the safest if it's secured as close as possible to it. The other is, sometimes I do something like implement masking and row-level security on the database, and then developers go off and do the same thing in their code. And the problem is duplicate security, first of all, impacts performance, but second of all, they might not overlap correctly. So if I mask the credit card number the way compliance requires it is masking all the numbers except for the last four, but the developers go and mask everything but the first four, then the data is completely masked, and now the masked data is no longer usable. So the other one, this is a little jab at my database administrator friends. Don't expect team members that are rewarded, measured, compensated, and given bonuses on increasing performance of a database to take on the role of securing it, because there's always a trade-off. Everything comes down to cost, benefit, and risk, and therefore, if you task people that are being benefit from taking shortcuts on security, you're not going to get the best security. So let's go to storage level security. So I'm literally talking about storage on servers. I'm talking about both physical and virtual and software defined. So encryption's always there. There's lots of information out there on encrypting storage level things. The new thing that's coming about and much more available in cloud services is immutability. That's usually talked about as confidential computing. This is a combination of compute, hardware, and software that physically keeps data from being changed. And that is, so even if someone were to gain access to a server, if it's been set up as confidential computing, it doesn't matter what access you have, you can't delete all that data, and it's immutable. It's literally not changeable. We also have to worry about air gaps, especially between backups and the actual production systems, but more and more air gapping saving of files is being replaced by this immutability. Backups are also a contentious issue with storage level only because if you encrypt your backups and you're storing it on an encrypted storage device, now you've doubly encrypted it. Is that paying too big of a price, or is it due to the fact that you want to make that if you're responsible for the backups, you don't want to have to rely on another party to have encrypted the other thing? The other thing that's newer in cloud services is client or customer managed keys and key vaults. I love this trend in cloud security. So key vaults mean I don't have to share passwords, I just share access to the vault. And client managed keys means I don't even have to trust the cloud vendor to be able to have access to the encryption keys. So some do's at storage level. Most of the breaches I hear about at the storage level are related to ransomware, are related to abnormal behaviors happening on storage, are related to insider threats and outsider threats. So I think the most important thing in all of these security things is make sure you're monitoring and you're monitoring the monitor to see if anyone's turned it off. You should review cases where you end up of multiple encryption of the same thing. Sometimes you want to pay that price. A lot of times you don't. I also believe, and this is me being facetious, you should assume that data in storage has no applications accessing it. Not for reals, but because you should secure data at the storage level and for files and JSONs and CSVs and PDFs. You should just secure it as if no application in the world exists out there to secure access to it. So native security as close as possible to where the data is. You should also consider deploying data loss prevention services. These literally are things that monitor and track and test for data exfiltration, test for massive overwrites of data, test is the wrong word, but automate the examination of unexpected behaviors. Also, data loss prevention is perfect across the normal end user estate, meaning hey, Karen just is trying to email a spreadsheet that has credit card numbers, customer numbers, and home addresses. Data loss prevention is the term that's used for that. I once worked at a place that stored their tape backups in the front lobby on a table so that Stone Mountain or someone could come in and take them away. Instead, no one came and took them away. The security guard threw them out at the end of every day. So that lacked physical security, it lacked good process, and it was also storing backups in a nearly public area in the lobby of the offices. The one final thing is, high availability is not disaster recovery. So we hear that a lot with storage. Oh, your data's stored 3 times, so we don't have to worry about backups that much. Well, there's a little bit of truth there in that there's less risk for certain types of data loss, such as if you have high availability because there's 3 or 5 copies of your data in physically separate places, then when one point of storage goes away, a hard drive fails or they lose power, you don't even need to use disaster recovery. It fails over, it gets replaced, and you might not even know it happened. So some types of disasters don't happen as much as high availability, but I'm here to tell you, you cannot rely on high availability to be your disaster recovery, because disaster recovery does not save you from someone going in and running an update query without the where clause. High availability is going to deploy that mass update everywhere. So some don'ts. Don't just rely on experienced on-prem team members when you go to design your cloud storage. You want experienced people there. They still have to bring their knowledge there. But there are things that are new on the cloud, and there are things that we have to do. So I'm not playing on experienced people. I'm playing on people who think about the traditional way we approach things. Don't ignore the availability of behavior analytics. This is what's one of the biggest things to help you avoid ransomware. And I think even the previous presenter talked about this. Cloud security is a shared responsibility. It's shared between your cloud provider and you. But make all your security decisions as if it weren't shared. So the only thing that a cloud provider can provide on their own that you can't deal with is physical security of the data center and the devices. And that's because you don't have access to it. And they all do, in what I understand, a much better job at physical security of cloud data centers than any of my sort of medium-sized enterprise people have done. Like, we used to get to go into the data center to cool off during the day. That's not really a thing at the cloud providers. The other one I hear all the time, well, no one's going to come attack us. So why are you so worried, Karen? Why are you so paranoid? And that's because it doesn't matter how important your data is, how much you have, how much money your company makes, is even if this were true, that your data isn't important, it's not that sensitive, it could still be an attack vector on other data elsewhere. It could still be in breach of the law. And with modern compliance and regulatory penalties, including criminal ones now in modern privacy legislation, you don't want to go to jail. You don't want to go to prison just because management said, we're not big enough to get attacked. So this is one of my favorite topics here. Modern cloud services. I've called it this only because these are the newest things I'm seeing. They have always existed in some form on-prem, but these are the things that, as I see them becoming more feature-rich, more available, that cloud providers also want your data to be secure, so they have very low cost and usability barriers to entry, is the newest advent of AI-assisted monitoring. And I know in these months, everyone's talking about AI, and we've got all the Chat GPT and Bing Chat and everything going on. But I mean, these AI-assisted monitoring, this has been going on for a while. It's just now getting more I call it branding to it. This means that we're not just saying, if Karen downloads 1,000 files, like a series of if statements, but literally looking at my normal behavior, not an employee's normal behavior or a data architect's normal behavior, but Karen's normal behavior to see if any data access or any data manipulation is happening that is out of band from what I would normally be doing. Also coming along with many of these AI-assisted monitoring tools is automated remediation. So if they think that I have been infected with a ransomware and the ransomware is now using my account to go encrypt or otherwise do bad things to the data, the safest thing that a company might decide is if they suspect ransomware, they should shut down all of my access on my account. And that's what they can do. Vulnerability assessments. Oh my gosh, I remember when on-prem database tools had some vulnerability assessments that were just, they did a good job. They're like, hey, this looks like a credit card number. You should probably encrypt it. Now vulnerability assessments are doing wonderful things. They can test for possible SQL injection. They could go look to see, hey, you've got data stored in an S3 bucket that is open to the public. Is that really what you want? These are some really important things that we can use compute and AI and logic and behavior assessments to go out and save us for those things. Because these are the types of analyses and assessments that compute is really good at. These also lead to security scores. And there's a lot of contention around these cloud provider security scores or security grades. And yeah, it is kind of a weird thing. But I'm here to tell you, manage your security score. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The automated remediation, the automated account suspension, to me, this is the only way that we're going to really be able to protect from ransomware and these mass changes to data. And the reason I say that is up until fairly recently, the way we did that is we had good backups and we had air gaps. That was our protection. Those are still 1,000% important, but they also take time. It takes time to restore. It takes time to provision a new system if that's needed, or go to a new data center if that's needed. If we can stop ransomware as it's spreading, even better. The other thing that's different about the cloud is also a contentious thing, telemetry that cloud providers collect about how features are used, how the services, and you can, in certain licensing scenarios, opt out of that. But it allows vendors to see where their pain points are, to help measure where your pain points are, to see which features are being used the most or deserve the most focus. I think that's a wonderful thing because in on-prem boxed things, vendors just had to do, consulting with their customers instead of gathering actual data there. The other big thing that I, as a data governance, data architect person, is this automated collection of data inventory. So you cannot secure what you do not know you have. And this is one of the biggest security threat surfaces at an organization, that automated data inventory, then data profiling, tagging, and classification allows someone with a security responsibility, which by the way is all of us, to understand what data is where, how much of it is, and how it needs to be protected. Some other things that didn't make it to the slide that are really important, the switch from going to a total firewall-based protection of our enterprise data now to zero trust, which firewalls are still important in that, but that we grant access only at the time we say this person needs access. There's also just-in-time access. So when I access a database, I want to access it just as a user, not as a DBA, not as an admin. And then I want to get that just-in-time admin access for when I really need it. And then things like conditional access. So conditional access, only from this location, only from these IPs, only from these devices, only from this combination of location and device. Conditional access is a new way and was provided first in cloud services. So some things to do. Go evaluate them constantly. Just because you've always done it one way doesn't mean the new fangled cloud way is the way not to do it. I'm a big fan of, I think you should plan on using them, especially these days where they tend to be multiple data sources, multiple data locations, multi-cloud, hybrid, on-prem. So there are plenty of these modern security cloud services that are hosted in the cloud that you can still secure things in all these other locations. The reason I want you to manage your security score is that an auditor could come in, or if you're being sued for a data breach or a violation of legislation, one of the things the other side's going to do is go make you submit what your security score is. And even if you don't believe in the security score, you don't think it measures what it should, you need to manage it because someone's going to ask for it. Or it's going to be a celebrity consultant who comes in, knows that you're not management, and goes to the executive and said, well, your current developers and DBAs have a security score on their systems of 45 out of 100. You should fire them all. So I'm not saying security score represents a true grade of your behaviors, but that if you don't manage it, if you don't go look at it, if you don't say, oh, you deducted 10 points for this, that's because we use another thing to do it, go away. And then you get your 10 points back because you said we're managing it another way. Make sure that wherever you can, you are automating detection and remediation of threats. You can't protect what you don't know about. You should be inventorying your data and classifying it and tagging it. But don't ignore the cost of these things. There is a cost, but measuring them according to cost, benefit, and risk. So if your organization has to pay $250 a month to run this one monitor, I think that's the best deal. Even if you're monitoring it yourself, it's still a great deal. Don't leave data classification and tagging up to humans. Humans have the final say of determining whether it's PII data or financial data or HIPAA data. But a big chunk of that work of inventorying and classifying can save a lot of time on those humans. And there are some people out there, it is contentious. You can go read some blogs where people say, don't do any of that classification and tagging because it makes it easier for bad actors to find all your juicy, valuable data. And the thing is, the bad actors are going to classify your data as soon as they get access. And so you're not in any way putting that data more at risk because you've classified a credit card number as financial data. It's kind of like, yeah, put a big old deadbolt on your door, but if you have full pane, single pane glass next to your door, someone's going to break into your home by breaking that glass. So data literacy, very quickly, you can't protect data you don't know, and humans are one of the biggest security attack vectors. So I work with a lot of people that don't know exactly what personally identifiable data is. They don't know that perhaps on a boarding pass, your special meal selection could be considered sensitive health data, even if it isn't under HIPAA. So having people understand their data is the first thing for them to know how to protect it. So we should be assessing people's data literacy about your organization's data. You should provide these data inventories, usually through a portal, resources, and tell data stories often. Don't assume people know. Don't say, oh, we'll just let people fail fast in working with the data, because now there are criminal and huge civil penalties for people who accidentally breach data. Don't shame the people. Don't blame the people. Talk about their behaviors. So I'm going to stop briefly here. Are there any questions? There's just a little bit more to go after this. Okay. So some regular cloud factors with security. I'm a big fan of role-based access versus account-based access. I know this happens in on-prem stuff, but one of the great things, say, in Azure Active Directory is this group-based or role-based access. So when someone leaves the company, you take their account out of that role and you don't have to find all the places where they were granted access. I like this because I believe the best security person is a lazy security person and therefore uses tools and approaches and techniques that save them the most time. I'm also a big fan of integrated on-prem and cloud Active Directory or other standards of authentication. It's just so much nicer and so much easier for admins, like database admins and storage admins and SharePoint admins, when they can use these integrated features. The other great thing about cloud and data is most cloud services give you high availability. 3, 5, 50 copies of your data, whatever you want. There's not usually an extra charge for that. Whereas when I had to do all my work on-prem servers, so let's say I had to set up a code repository, and I would get spare space on some server that was way under provisioned, and there was no HA for it because it was just development or because it wasn't deemed as highly critical data. Now you just have high availability. You set up a really inexpensive $5 a month test database in Azure, maybe $10 a month. You're still getting high availability. You might choose, because you're playing with it, to not have it be regionally redundant, multiple reads, all of that stuff, but it's just built in. The other great things is you can go to cloud services and find what security and compliance standards that particular service meets. So there's no such thing as Google Cloud compliance, because there's no such thing as Azure's compliance or Azure being HIPAA compliant. You have to go to each service, each part of it, to see what compliance and security standards they already meet. The other thing, as we know with cloud computing, it's metered cost. That's great because you can spin up a server, use it, turn it off, just pay for the storage cost of it. But that's also a double-edged sword. So for any of you experienced enough that to remember long-distance calling when everyone had to pay for it and it was by the minute and you had to talk fast and you couldn't talk for a long time because it was by the minute, we have to go back to bringing those same sort of cost, benefit, and risk standards to metered costs. But overall, I think metered costing, paying per service, per compute, per hour, per day, or whatever, if you do it smartly, you can end up even saving money on a lot of workloads or perhaps paying more on other workloads, but it's totally worth it because you're getting all these other benefits. The other thing that's harder to understand is because a service might involve compute, storage, auditing, scalability, all these consistency levels, all of these things. Instead of billing you separately for that, they create what I'm calling mixed units. They're really made up units, like a database unit or an integration unit or a storage unit that involves all of those things. So you have to understand these, and it's used both for provisioning, like if this database starts costing me more than 100 database units, start throttling the workloads because I don't want to pay more than that. Or you could say, I want to provision 100, let it scale up to 1,000, but let me know when it scales past 500. So that's a different way of costing things. And then the most important thing, reserved resources, so that you can say, I'm going to pay a little bit more, but I want to guarantee that that resource is going to be there. So some do's: start using modern security access and auth standards instead of built-in login credentials and management just in your code. Leverage all the high availability that comes for basically free along with your payments. Review all the security and compliance things. And don't let someone drag out an old storage calculation spreadsheet from 5 years ago, because I can guarantee you the units, the cost, the pricing, the scalability, the provision levels have all changed up for that. So use the online calculators and even get help calculating your potential costs. And then don't forget that you can reserve reservations for when you need to make sure that that scalable unit is available. More and more, don't roll your own features, don't roll your own high availability if you're in the cloud. Don't ignore auto scalability options so that you don't get that 3 AM call that the database ran out of space or you ran out of numbers or whatever it was. Don't ignore multi-factor authentication and passwordless options. I'm telling you, anyone who is logging into customer data who isn't required to have some sort of multi-factor, probably you're not doing even the bare minimum of security. And the problem is many legacy applications and services that you might be running on-prem or packages don't have support for that. So consider abandoning legacy resources that do not support this bare minimum of security. Don't ever share credentials, and don't ignore how granular you can make auditing. Because having talked about all these things, the data you support deserves your love. So I'll go very quickly for these last top 10 tips for securing your cloud data. Architect for the cloud when it comes to security, no lift and shift security. Because I'm telling you, there's going to be gaps, overlaps, and loopholes if you just try to just run something in the cloud. The other thing, trade-off with cloud things is you never have to worry about upgrading anything because the cloud provider does it. But now you need to use a modern change management plan from what you did on-prem because those aren't going to work. You can't say, well, we won't upgrade our Azure SQL DB until after the acquisition of XYZ Widget Corporation completes next year because you can't stop that upgrade. I want to remind you that the cloud-based security services have so matured and innovated in just the last couple of years. So if you checked them out a couple of years ago, definitely come back and check them out. I am just in awe of the things I can do now to protect data. Also remember that there may be other costs than what you see in a cost calculation. And the reason I bring this up in a security presentation is that if your system becomes unavailable because it's cost constrained, because there's a limit placed on it, then I consider that data is not available, and a down system might also not be a secure system. And you cannot secure what you don't know about. So if someone in your organization is not currently working on right now inventorying and cataloging your data, and there's some old spreadsheet from 5 years ago that a previous consultant made, you're going to have a lot of vulnerabilities out there because the bad actors are going to find it. And just tell everyone, there's going to be a breach of our data. It will happen. And not all of them will be from outside actors. And not all of them will just be one hacker trying to do it, because now we have state-funded bad actors breaching all kinds of data systems, not necessarily because they want your data, but because they want to be able to get into where the data points to. Be lazy. Go tell your boss, Karen told you be lazy. Automate detection and remediation. Security these days in a data state is more complex if you're multi-cloud hybrid and on-premises data. That's not necessarily a bad thing because this is all a trade-off. Just plan for that additional complexity. Let cloud security systems do all this work if you can outsource it to them. I don't mean companies, I mean the actual cloud systems. And I added in an extra one. You don't really need backups. What you need are restores. This is a snarky tweet. I tweet on a regular basis. Yes, you need to test your backups, but unless you're testing your restores, it doesn't matter if your backups pass those plans. Test your restores. And just in the end, the reason you want to do all this is to love your data. So you all are great. I wonder if we have any questions or comments now.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Let's see if we can get maybe one or two in before the top of the hour here, if you're cool with that. Okay, here's a great one. How do we convince developers not to duplicate security policies in their applications if they are in the database? I love this one.
That's one tough one I have. And I'll give you a short story. I used to put reference data in tables in the database because that's an agile business process. So you don't have to change the code in a dropdown. You just change it in the database, and now the dropdown provides the new code or the revised code. My developers thought, yeah, that's great. And then they hard-coded all the codes in their application as well, which meant that when we added a new code to that table, it didn't show up in the dropdown. It just had the old stuff. It's really more of telling people we need to architect for certain business needs for that cost, benefit, and risk. And yes, if you've sent someone to a good security application hardening thing and they develop these best practices, work with the developers, understand that they want to do the right thing, and just say, you need to find the best place to do that. If I mask the data in the database, you don't have to write a drop of code to mask that data, and I'm the data expert, so I know how to mask it. I know what the laws are for it. Now you don't have to go look those things up. But yeah, that's an ongoing who does what, when, where question.
Okay, let's get one more in real quick. What if we can't use the cloud due to security risks?
I know the previous speaker kind of addressed something similar to this too. I do know that there are some legislated things that people can't use the cloud. I think maybe a lot of that legislation is maybe outdated or misinformed. But I also think there's a lot of sort of tales going about. And the example I'll use is that I've worked in enterprises that didn't have, a full-blown multi-departmental data protection and security team. And a lot of the practices I see in security services in the cloud and all the constant monitoring that's happening on the cloud provider's end, I think more and more it's harder to make the claim that cloud is automatically less secure than what you can do on-prem. So it really is coming down to, do we have the current data about security risks and attack surfaces?
Okay, well, that hour just completely flew by. Thanks for the great talk, Karen.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Everyone go love your data.